Drive through almost any American town founded before 1960, and you'll pass a graveyard of architecture that nobody builds anymore. Not a real graveyard, these houses are still standing, still lived in, still loved by the people who own them. But the styles themselves? Dead. Extinct. You could commission the finest builder in the country today, hand them an unlimited budget, and they still couldn't give you an authentic version of what used to rise on every street in America. The knowledge left with the craftsmen who carried it. The materials stopped being made. The zoning codes made it illegal. And somewhere along the way, we simply stopped wanting what our great-grandparents wanted. So let's walk through the styles that vanished, not because they failed, but because the world that made them possible disappeared right out from under them. Start with the Victorians, because that's where most people's minds go first when they picture a house that looks like it belongs in a different century. But Victorian isn't really one style, it's an umbrella for a dozen wildly different obsessions. Queen Anne houses, with their turrets and wraparound porches and that riot of textures, fish scale shingles here, clapboard there, a stained glass window tucked into a gable for no practical reason except that it was beautiful. These houses were asymmetrical on purpose. Nothing lined up. A roofline might have 4 or 5 different pitches fighting each other, and somehow it worked. Builders in the 1880s and 1890s treated a house almost like a sculpture, piling on porches and bay windows and decorative brackets because industrialization had just made all that ornamentation cheap and fast to produce. A factory could stamp out gingerbread trim by the mile. So people used it lavishly. Then there's the Second Empire style, easiest to spot by its mansard roof, that distinctive shape with the steep, almost vertical lower slope and the flatter top, often punctuated by dormer windows poking straight out of the roofline. It came from France, named after the reign of Napoleon III, and for a couple of decades in the mid-1800s it was the height of American sophistication. City halls had them. Train stations had them. Plenty of grand family homes had them too. And then, almost overnight, the style fell out of fashion so hard that Second Empire became a kind of shorthand for gloomy and old-fashioned, which is exactly why horror movies love using these houses as haunted mansions. The Addams family house is basically Second Empire gone to seed. Move a little earlier and you land on the Italianate style, which dominated the decades right before and after the Civil War. Low-pitched roofs, tall narrow windows often arched at the top, deep overhanging eaves supported by ornamental brackets, the whole look was meant to evoke an Italian farmhouse or villa, even if the actual house was sitting on a flat lot in Ohio. Builders loved Italianate because it was flexible. You could build a modest version for a shopkeeper or a sprawling version for a railroad baron, and both would read as tasteful. Cast iron storefronts in old downtown districts often borrow the same decorative language, which is part of why so many historic main streets have that unified, dignified look even though they were built by dozens of different people over decades. Before the Victorians took over, there was the Greek Revival era, and this one's worth sitting with for a moment because it says something about how Americans saw themselves. After independence, the country was hungry for a visual identity that wasn't British. Ancient Greece, the birthplace of democracy, fit the story perfectly. So suddenly courthouses, banks, and farmhouses alike sprouted columns. Full temple front porches on modest homes in rural Ohio and upstate New York. White painted wood standing in for marble. Triangular pediments over the front door like a shrunken Parthenon. It sounds almost absurd out of context, a dirt farmer's house wearing the costume of a Greek temple, but at the time it was a genuine statement of national pride, and you can still find these houses scattered through New England and the old Northwest Territory, quietly declaring their allegiance to an idea rather than a king. And going back even further, there's Federal style and Georgian style, the architecture of the earliest American Republic and the colonies before it. Symmetrical, restrained, formal, a center door flanked by evenly spaced windows, a fanlight over the entrance, brick facades laid in careful patterns. These houses look almost stern compared to what came later, but that restraint was the point. Order and proportion were considered moral qualities back then, not just aesthetic ones. A well-balanced house was thought to reflect a well-balanced mind. Now here's where things get interesting, because not every extinct style was about wealth or grandeur. The shotgun house, common across the South and especially in New Orleans, was a working-class design, narrow, one room wide, rooms lined up front to back with doors aligned so a shotgun blast could theoretically pass straight through the house without hitting a wall, which is supposedly where the name comes from, though historians still argue about that origin story. What's not up for debate is how practical these houses were. Narrow lots meant more houses could fit on a block. High ceilings and aligned doors created natural airflow in brutal southern summers, decades before air conditioning existed. It was vernacular architecture, built by ordinary people solving an ordinary problem, and it produced a look that's now instantly recognizable and almost impossible to replicate legally, since modern setback and lot width requirements make that narrow footprint practically extinct. Speaking of solving problems with clever design, the American Foursquare deserves a mention, even though it's less flashy than its Victorian cousins. Simple, boxy, 2.5 stories, a big front porch, a hipped roof with a central dormer. It doesn't scream for attention the way a Queen Anne does, and that was the appeal. The Foursquare was the practical, middle-class answer to Victorian excess, roomy inside, efficient to build, and popular from the 1890s clear through the 1920s. You could order the plans from a catalog, sometimes even the entire house in a kit shipped by rail, cut lumber and all, and assemble it yourself. Sears sold thousands of them. That idea alone, a full house arriving by train, ready to be built like an oversized piece of furniture, belongs to a completely different manufacturing world than the one we live in now, which brings us to the bungalow and the broader Craftsman movement, maybe the style most people feel genuine nostalgia for today. Low-pitched roofs, deep porches held up by tapered columns often resting on stone or brick piers, exposed rafter tails, built-in cabinetry and window seats inside. The Craftsman movement was a reaction against the mass-produced ornamentation of the Victorian era, a return to visible handwork, natural materials, and honest construction. Ironically, it became one of the most mass-produced styles in American history, spreading from California bungalow courts to working-class neighborhoods across the entire country in the early 20th century. Original Craftsman woodwork, the kind with real joinery and old-growth lumber, simply isn't economical to reproduce today. The old-growth trees that supplied that dense, tight-grained wood were logged out generations ago. And then there's a style that gets a little more polarizing, the streamlined modern and Art Deco homes of the 1930s, all smooth curved corners, glass block windows, horizontal racing stripes cut into stucco, porthole windows straight off an ocean liner. This was architecture in love with the future, speed, machines, aerodynamics, all filtered down into private houses even though a house obviously doesn't need to be aerodynamic. It's one of the more overtly optimistic styles ever built in America, arriving right in the middle of the Depression, as if the buildings themselves were trying to convince people that better days were coming. So why did all of this stop? A few reasons, tangled together. Labor costs are the big one, that hand-turned trim, that custom brickwork, that individually milled woodwork, all of it depended on skilled trades that were relatively cheap in their era and are anything but cheap now. Building codes changed too, especially after fires and disasters exposed the risks in some of these older construction methods. Materials changed. Old-growth lumber, real slate, hand-thrown brick, largely gone or prohibitively expensive. And frankly, taste changed. After the Second World War, America fell in love with efficiency, with the ranch house, with clean lines and open floor plans and attached garages. Ornamentation started to look wasteful instead of impressive. A whole generation of builders pivoted toward speed and standardization, and the elaborate styles of the previous century simply stopped making economic sense. But here's the thing worth sitting with as we close this out. These houses didn't disappear because people stopped loving them. Drive through any older neighborhood today and you'll see them beautifully restored, painted in period-accurate colors, cared for like family heirlooms, because in a way, that's exactly what they are. Each one is a fossil of a particular decade's confidence, a particular generation's idea of what a home should say about the people inside it. We can't build them the same way anymore. But we can still walk past them, still recognize a Queen Anne turret or a Craftsman porch column from half a block away, and still feel that small jolt of connection to a version of America that built its personality right into the walls. And maybe that's the real reason these old styles still matter, not because we lost the ability to build them, but because we haven't lost the ability to love them.